The Coldest Valentine by Kaylee Johnson, February 2022. Read by Kaylee Johnson. The most beautiful woman in Galveston. No, not Miss Betty Brown of the decade before, nor Anna Held, who appeared at the Grand Opera House 3 years after. This story is about a fictitious character, but no less sought after by gentlemen callers, and no less admired for her beauty and voice. This is the story of Miss Edwina Rockford and the great snow that fell on Valentine's Day of 1895. Shortly after her debut, or somewhere thereabouts, Edwina began to perform. Her beauty alone was reason enough for young men to suit her favor, but her angelic voice enchanted the hearts of gentlemen throughout the city, further into the state of Texas and beyond. She rivaled the Gibson girl in her distant coldness, with her dismissive attitude and playful smirks, for she would receive her callers, but attach herself to none, receive their gifts, but play no favorites. Indeed, no amount of competition between her admirers amounted to any advantage, for if two happened to call at once, Edwina would slip out the back door to her best friend and neighbor, Billy. Since childhood, Billy would skip out of lessons to bring her sweetmeats and candies, golden apples and candy whistles, but now from afternoon till night they would sit on the back step or out by the carriage house, under the oak or against the palms to discuss classic literature, his lessons, or the debate from the literary society he and his father had attended the night before. This is what Billy liked about her most. It was true. She had soft hair and pure white skin, full cheeks that blushed like the primrose, and hair swept back in soft waves. But her friendship, her wit, her wonder, her attentiveness, was so much beauty before him it was unclear as to whether he was lost in the graces of her nature or the graces of her appearance, but to him they were one and the same. Being no more than a year her senior, with only a hope of a position at the bar, he dare not mention his secret wish, not with so many rejected admirers calling upon her weekly. Even still, on this particular night, he began to hope, for no gentleman had called, but Edwina had come out the back door just the same. It was February, and the two friends sat huddled on the porch step, Edwina with her skirt tucked tight over her knees, and Billy with his scarf wrapped tightly round his neck. "Valentine's Day is tomorrow," he casually remarked. "You'll be receiving a lot of callers, I suppose." Edwina stood up from the step and plucked dirt from her skirt. "Yes," she sighed wearily, looking to the cistern above the kitchen, then to the sky which threatened to rain. "They keep leaving their cards, not to mention the steady stream of Valentine cards I've been receiving. By the amount I get from Mr. Crawley, I half expect him this evening." "Would you like that?" Billy tested. But by her tone he was not surprised by her next outburst. "No, I can't stand the sight of him. He has a mustache and wears a monocle, two things I simply cannot stand. If a gent is going to call, I must see his face. I must know with whom I speak." Subconsciously, Billy reached his hand to his own face and smoothed his finger and thumb over his bare lip and chin. "You don't mind if—" Edwina looked up and softened. "Oh, I do hope you weren't planning on growing one, for only old men wear whiskers. You make it sound as if your callers were from the Civil War age. They might as well be. Mr. Flagon is 41. Billy stuffed his hands in his pockets, shrugged his shoulders against the cold, then pulled up his collar to block the wind. Wincing either against the northern blast or for fear of what she would say next, he asked, "Supposing I sent you a Valentine's card, would you read it?" "Please don't," Edwina replied, dropping her hand from the back door. "I have so many already." Billy dropped his gaze and nodded, but stood like a sheepdog braced against the wind. Then, remembering what she said about mustaches and monocles, he smirked. She must not have a high view of his professor. As if reading his thoughts, Edwina asked, "Your professor is coming down tomorrow, isn't he?" "Yes." "Won't you ask him then of who St. Valentine really was? I hardly think it was lace-trimmed love notes and lithographed poems. But if it was all that frill and nonsense, seeing his face blush to tell the tale would be something to talk of, don't you think?" Her eyes twinkled with mischief as she asked it. Then she sobered to explain. "All I could find was that he was a bishop imprisoned and beheaded by Claudius II, with no reference to love at all. Do come back tomorrow and tell me what you find." Edwina went to bed that night, wondering how many callers would actually call, how many flowers or chocolates or knickknacks she'd have to display, and how St. Valentine himself must have felt sitting in his prison cell the night of the 13th. The awning that half covered her bed got much attention before she finally closed her eyes, only to shudder and rise a moment later to put more coal on the fire and another blanket on her bed. A chill had swept in with the rain, and even with these measures she fell asleep cold. At morning light, Edwina rose. The stubborn chill still filled the air, but this Valentine's Day was brighter than the usual winter morning. Going to the window, Edwina pulled aside the curtain. All around her, on the railings of the veranda, on the neighbors' roofs, on the lawns, the oaks, the palms, blanketing the ground all about, was the whitest, thickest coating of snow. Such brilliance, magnificence! All the humid chill was forgotten, and pulling on her tea-gown and tying it on as she ran, Edwina hurried into the hall, then to the back window of the spare bedroom. Whiteness as far as the eye could see. The last time there had been an ice storm, the telegraph lines were down, and the phone lines too. Perhaps the trains themselves would be stopped up. With the prospect of a whole day to herself, Edwina sailed down to eat breakfast, but only got halfway down when a knock came to the front door. Freezing on the staircase, not knowing whether to go back upstairs or wait to see who was there, she watched as the maid came around the corner, answered the door, and took a bouquet of flowers. "Who are they from?" "Mr. Crawley," the maid said, looking up from reading the card. "E.P. Crawley." A draught filled the house as the maid closed the door and went to carry the flowers to the hall table. Rushing to the parlor, Edwina parted the curtains. Footsteps to and from her front door were clearly marked in the snow. If the delivery boy could come, who else would? Sitting down to breakfast, Edwina unfolded the serviette and laid it in her lap. The maid brought in the morning mail and set it in an unsteady pile on the corner of the table, where it threatened any moment to topple over. Crunching into a cracker, Edwina finally dipped it in her tea to soften it. Then, with a sigh, she addressed her mail. Delicately, she lifted the first card from the stack, an accumulation of the past 3 days, of both calling cards left in the basket in the hall and letters arrived by mail. But after reading the first line, "I very much desire to make your acquaintance," she tossed it aside. The next was a Valentine card of roses, and the next a poem surrounded by lace. "A loving heart is a priceless treasure." A smile softened Edwina's face, but on turning it over, a chill ran down her spine. It was signed, "Ever attentive, yours truly, E.P. Crawley." As if shuffling through the rest of the pile would rid herself of the feeling, Edwina hurried past another letter from Mr. Crawley, postmarked the day before. She hardly expected the tone of it to be any different than his first ardent letter, addressed to her after he had first seen her appear on stage. It had touched his heart, he wrote, his very soul, and he would fain anything to take her hand. She had not replied, and had not received him, and had not written any letter in return. But he had called that Friday, and the Monday next, and he promised to call today. Oh, that the train would snow him out, and he would be prevented from coming. Such things happened in Canada. and farther points in the northern states. Oh, that coldness could dampen his passion. Clinking her teacup to its saucer, Edwina rose from the table and called in the maid. Snatching up the bundle of mail, she thrust it toward her. Take this into the study. I will attend to it later. Juggling all the notes and cards, the maid protested. But, miss, you haven't attended to it for days. Edwina looked sharply at her, then snatched up the Harper's Bazaar. I am not to be disturbed. And Mildred? She spun about at the doorway. My tea was cold. With the ladies' magazine under her arm, Edwina retreated upstairs to the spare bedroom, her favorite room in the house, because it overlooked the backyard and the walk where she could see if Billy happened to drop by. It was from this vantage point that she opened the most recent issue of the Harper's Bazaar, February 9th, 1895, and read its opening poem. The Hopeful Lover on St. Valentine's Day. Fair Mistress Prue, to whom I sue, whose hand I hope to win, if faith she wears the daintest shoe a maid e'er footed in, and when so like a saucy ship with toss and trip she goes, with jealous smarts she fills the hearts of half a score of beaux. The poem had 2 more stanzas, but affronted by it fitting her situation, Edwina restlessly turned the pages to read the fashions of Paris, the latest design of Worth, and soon began to dream of red velvet sleeves for a new evening gown. She was appearing on stage later that week, and had a dress that could be altered to feature red velvet sleeves in place of cotton, muslin, or silk. Cheered by this prospect, she went to her wardrobe to select a dress, tried on 2 or 3, then settled on one for the day, sat down to arrange her hair, and read the rest of a novel until the clock struck noon. But, being in the middle of a chapter, she read a little more, then, because it was interesting, 2 chapters more. By 1 o'clock she was sufficiently ready for luncheon, and laid the book aside with a sigh, then sailed into the dining room. Did Billy call? No, miss, the maid replied, but Mr. Davis called, and Mr. Hoffman sent a parcel that must definitely be opened today. Add Mr. Davis's card to the others, Edwina said, waving her aside, and by all means, open the package if it is urgent. You may keep the contents if he has sent me a puppy or a kitten. I am not fond of animals. Calmly, Edwina poured herself a steaming cup of tea and lifted it to her lips. But at the sight out of the window, her eyes grew wide, and she left her teacup in its saucer. With all the girlish delight of discovering snow in the morning, Edwina rushed to the window and declared, "It's snowing!" From the dining room window she could see nothing but flakes falling between her house and Billy's. With her face pressed so close to the glass that she felt the coldness through the pane, and with the warmth of the fire at her side, she stood there a long while, marveling at the soft flakes floating down, being blown this way and that, clinging to each other as they drifted, and slowly but surely mounting on top of everything. From behind her, the maid marveled in delight and left the room to tell the cook, but had the presence of mind to come back a moment later and say, "Your tea, miss. It's getting cold." With a cooler temper than she had used that morning, Edwina returned to the table, sipped the tea, and said, "So it is. Boil me more water, Mildred, and," as an idea struck her, "I'll take my luncheon upstairs." Seated at the spare bedroom window, Edwina ate her lunch and marveled at the driving snow. Twice she heard the front door open, and both times she tucked the shawl more securely round her shoulder. "Mr. Crawley here to see you, miss." Edwina jumped, but not at the maid's announcement from the doorway. Below her window, coming up the walk, was Billy. Tapping on the window, Edwina waved frantically. Then when he looked up, she giggled at how he winced and blinked from the snowflakes falling into his eyes. "My professor is snowed in," Billy called, He just telephoned from Houston. No lessons today." Clapping in girlish delight, Edwina turned to Mildred and ordered, "Go get my coat and my matching hat." "But Mr. Crawley—" "He can stay if he wishes." Then she turned back to the window and shouted through the pane, "I'm coming right down, Billy." Helplessly the maid returned with the fur-trimmed jacket and held it while Edwina arranged her hat and fished for the best place to jab the pin. "Mr. Crawley won't like this, miss. He insists he won't leave until he sees you." "Then give him my picture." "He says he already has one, the one you gave him last time." Edwina stopped buttoning up her coat. "He kept it?" "Pulled it out of his front pocket. Says he keeps it over his heart." "Dear me." Then remembering Billy, Edwina buttoned up the last button, pulled on her gloves, and grabbed her muff before hurrying down to face Mr. Crawley. At the fireplace in the parlor, Mr. Crawley leaned against the mantel, tall and stately as usual. Hearing her foot on the hall, he turned and, "Oh my!" Edwina cried, for instead of the sophisticated man, he was sopping wet, hair and mustache limp and sagging, instead of waxed and stiff. Thrown off by his bedraggled appearance, Edwina lost her customary cool and anxiously began, "I thought you would be detained by the snow." "I took the morning train," he said, stumbling over the footstool on his way across the room. "Nothing could detain me. No weather, no tempest." "You will have to excuse me, Mr. Crawley," Edwina said hastily, backing into the hall. "But Miss Rockford—" Looking over her shoulder as she ran out the back door, Edwina saw Mr. Crawley advancing down the hall. At the same time, Billy met her, saying cheerfully, "Can you believe this snow?" Grabbing his arm as if they were school children about to get caught, Edwina said, "We're going to buy red velvet." "What?" "I'm making balloon sleeves." Looking over her shoulder, Billy saw the tall gent looking past the maid, so Billy stumbled after Edwina and down the back lane, slipping and sliding in the gathering slush. "Since when have you taken up dressmaking?" "Today," she said, hurrying along. "Mr. Crawley keeps calling, and I want red velvet balloon sleeves. You came in the nick of time, Billy. You came in the nick of time." When they got downtown, they got caught in the crossfire of a snowball fight. Bankers and merchants and shoppers alike were hurling snowballs across the street. Grinning from the merriment, they joined in, hurling snowballs at anyone and everyone, until the crowds began to thin. By then, Edwina forgot her scarlet sleeves. What they needed now were gum boots. From store to store they went, but all the gum boots were sold out, until, in Marks and Blum, there was one pair left, and just her size. While Edwina stood at the counter searching for her change purse, and realizing she must buy on credit, a tall man came up, doffed his hat, and said, "Allow me." Eyes wide, Edwina took the shoes off the counter, looked around for Billy, then as the bell rang and a girl came in, she plopped the boots in her hand. "Gum boots, dearest, last pair." Then taking Billy by the arm, she dragged him outside. "Who was that?" Edwina looked over her shoulder. "A man who keeps sending me music," she said, slipping and sliding through the slushy snow. "He's convinced we're the perfect duet." "On stage or off stage?" Billy asked, frowning. Edwina shuddered. "Oh, let's get out of here." In an attempt to get as far away from the crowds as possible, they soon found themselves on the edge of town, at the stately buildings of the University of Texas Medical School. Pushing snow off an old crate, they sat down to rest, looking across the yard at the snowmen the medical students had made, backdropped by the bright red brick of Nicholas Clayton's building, which later came to be known as Old Red. Softly the flakes kept falling, and softly Edwina rested her head on Billy's shoulder. It was all he could do not to put his arm around her, but instead, after glancing around that there were no men there but the snowmen and himself, he finally broke the silence by saying, "I found out what St. Valentine was known for." As if aroused from sleep, Edwina sat up, stood up, then brushed off the freshly fallen snow from her skirt, and with a spark in her eye she looked toward the south and teased, "I wonder what the beach looks like in all this snow." Halfway across the island, they both agreed that hiring a sleigh would have been better than slipping and sliding and trudging through a foot of snow. At one turn they came upon a streetcar stranded in the heavy snow, and twice they saw a makeshift cutter go by, but by the time they thought of hailing one, they were already past the Ursuline Academy. A few more blocks, and the beach would be in view. With the north wind to their backs, they cleared the last house and saw the great expanse of snow in place of sand, white cloud in place of blue sky, and gray breakers rolling on and on upon the shore. Billy looked down at Edwina, who scrunched up her nose at the sight. Moisture wet the fringe of her hair. From her breath or the falling flakes he could not tell, frizzing every loose strand till droplets formed on their tips. "I suppose it looks better in summer," Edwina said. Billy laughed. A forced laugh, where he willed himself to look away from her angelic face and to the dismal sight she was referring to. Following her gaze down the beach, he saw the beach hotel and remarked, "Will you look at that? The red stripes are gone." The central octagon, the bathhouse out front, the west wing, the east wing, each roof's red and white stripes covered in a blanket of snow. "The hotel looks better in the summertime, too," Edwina remarked, "but I wager there's a fire inside." Edwina looked up at him with a glint in her eyes. Then, without warning, she took off down the beach as fast as their slipping boots would allow. Not to be outdone, even by gorgeous Edwina, Billy took to his heels, easily past her, then when he heard her voice far behind him, looked over his shoulder. She had fallen face first into the snow and was laughing, snow-covered, face uplifted and imploring, hand outstretched for help. Marveling at how the snow clung to their clothes, they shook it out and picked off clumps as they walked up the steps of the hotel. Indeed, there was a fire in the lobby, and laying aside their overcoats, they sat down before it. Neither said anything, as fire is apt to make a person do, but they soon fell to exchanging glances, and muffling their laughter when from behind them, at the desk, they heard an irate traveler steam off about how he and his wife had come down to see the beach, to the southwest for warmer weather, to feel the sun, to enjoy the marvels of the south in its ever-present warmth. "Furthermore," he shouted, "there is a draft in our bedroom. The snow has forced its way in. I tell you, there is a pile of snow on the windowsill." Edwina and Billy smirked at the traveler's predicament, then fell to silently observing the fire again after the clerk appeased him. Billy looked at Edwina as the snow melted off her hair and dripped on her face, her perfect face, devoid of any blemish and softer now in the glow of the fire. A sweet smile rested there, and he could have looked on her all day, but knowing he had something yet to make her even more happy, he pulled out a notebook from his pocket and handed it to her. "We don't have many books on the subject," he apologized, "but I stayed up till midnight perusing our library to get you your answer on St. Valentine." Quickly, Edwina read the note, then asked, "He was beheaded for uniting two lovers in marriage?" "He was beheaded for saving the family despite a conqueror's command." Intrigued, Edwina leaned forward. "The Emperor, Claudius II, believed soldiers made better warriors when they didn't have wives or children, so he banned them from getting married. A bishop named St. Valentine saw the injustice of the decree and married couples in secret. He was discovered, imprisoned, and beheaded. So you see," Billy said, smiling and leaning back in his chair, "St. Valentine has something to do with romance after all." Eyes glowing and looking twice their size in the closeness of indoors, Edwina looked again at the notebook. then launched into a discussion filled with questions of the Roman Empire, the emperor, the soldiers, and anything connected to it, till the fire grew dim and Billy twice had to throw on another log. He was just through laying all the histories he knew of the Roman conquests, when from the greater part of the lobby the desk clerk came up to Edwina's chair, bowed low, and said, "I beg your pardon, Miss Rockford." The man's mustache twitched. "It is Miss Rockford, isn't it?" Edwina straightened. The man straightened. "Excuse my boldness, but I am told you are a great singer. It has been so long since we've had any entertainment here at the Beach Hotel. Wouldn't you, on this rare occasion, on account of the snow, that is, and with the guests stranded here for the night, won't you delight us with your talents?" Billy wasn't sure if his own mouth hung open because Edwina's mouth was agape, or if it was at the forwardness of this man. One glance from Edwina was all Billy needed before he sprang to his feet and offered her his arm. "We were just about to dine, weren't we?" Taking his arm, her white lips formed the words, "Yes." "Perhaps after dinner?" the clerk pressed. "Some other night," Billy said, tapping Edwina's hand. "Now, will you direct us to the dining room?" At first Billy was concerned that they weren't properly dressed for dinner, but, as Edwina said nothing, he soon became concerned for how pale she had become. He was not at ease until midway through the meal her color began to return. A new concern arose, however, when she ordered not one, but 2 desserts. By now all the dinner guests had left, and she still ordered fresh coffee and crumpets. At last, when he asked for the bill, she suggested they ride out and watch the stars appear. "No, I'm taking you home." All the joy and delight drained from her face. "Edwina, But whenever she looked at him, he lost his nerve. So instead of asking what was in his heart, he said, "You really don't like those collars, do you?" Sadly, she shook her head. "They'll be there. I can't go back." "But it's your home. You don't have to admit them." "I know," she said sorrowfully, then let him help her into her jacket. The snow was still falling when they stepped outside, and the only twinkling lights were the snowflakes illuminated by the light of the street lamps. For blocks they walked in silence. Edwina snuggled in tighter and tucked her head in against the wind, which gave him courage to finally broach the subject when, meditatively, like she had been thinking on it for some time, it was Edwina who spoke. "Would you visit me if I never sang again?" "What?" "Would you still visit me if I never sang again?" Feeling like a dope for asking her to repeat the question, which he had understood but been surprised by, Billy saw this as his opportunity. "Well," he began, feeling the weight of her question, "I visited you before you sang, and before your debut, and I visit you even now. I don't think anything would change." She pulled away, and Billy doubted he had said the right thing. But after a full day spent with Edwina, and the thought of gentlemen callers waiting at her house even now, he stopped in the middle of the intersection and waited for her to notice and turn around. When she did, he announced, "I'd like to call on you, Edwina, through the front door." Their breath froze on the air, white clouds of vapor. The electric street lights swung on the wire above, casting shadows on Edwina's face, but holding Billy's in full light. At last, Edwina's voice rose from the darkness, as soft as the fur that trimmed her coat. "You may call if you wish. And may I be the only one admitted?" "If you like," she said shyly, then shivered. She was smiling. He was smiling. But looking up into his exuberant face, she said, "This has been the coldest Valentine's Day of my life." Laughing in spite of it, she shivered again. Billy hardly needed his coat now, and unbuttoning it, he threw it over her shoulders. "Only a few blocks more," he said to encourage her and to protest her refusing it. From Broadway to Ball, the walk was far too short. Indeed, Billy could have walked the whole beach with his burning wish granted, but as they came up to her dark house, he rested his foot on the veranda and leaned back to admire her. Before him was his friend, his comrade, Edwina. But how delicate and fragile she looked in his overcoat wrapped twice around her waist. Whether it was the night or the cold, or the charms of a once-in-a-lifetime snowstorm, the admired Miss Rockford had accepted him. Still in his bulky coat, she turned back as she was about to go in. "You may send me a valentine, if you like, but only if you promise to deliver it yourself." "Oh," and she moved to take off the coat. "Keep it. I only live next door. I'll come fetch it tomorrow when I bring you your valentine." Eyes glowing, Edwina smiled. "Perhaps you can help me sort my mail. I've a myriad of valentines to dispose of." Grinning, Billy bid her good night, and the two parted ways, meeting up the next morning to sort through her mail and build a big fire in the study. The end. Thanks for listening.